Part 2. Foundations. In Part 1, I tried to deflect some of the problems that beset thinking about ethics. But we still have to worry whether our favorite ethical principles are capable of proof. We might still fear that the voice of conscience is a delusion. We might still flounder when we try to gain some sense of its authority. Are truth and knowledge possible, or does reasoning about what to do eventually hinge on nothing but banging the table, sheer brute will? Or are there yet other alternatives? 8. Two species of reason. In order to think about the place of reason in ethics, we need to make a distinction. A holy grail in practical philosophy would be a reason that everyone must acknowledge to be a reason independently of their sympathies and inclinations. I shall call that a reason, with a capital letter. It would arm-lock everyone. You could not ignore it or discount it just because you feel differently. It would have a necessary influence, or what philosophers sometimes call apodictic force. It would bind all rational agents, insofar as they are rational. If you offer someone a reason, no capital letter, and they shrug it off, you might say they are insensitive or inhuman, callous or selfish, obsessive or weird, imprudent or sentimental. These are defects of the heart. You may regret them, but if the audience feels differently, you may not be able to prove to them that they are defects at all. But if you offer someone a capital letter reason and they shrug it off, then something different is wrong. Their very rationality is in jeopardy. There is something wrong with their heads. Philosophers, of course, are professionally wedded to reasoning, so it is natural to them to hope that we can find reasons. Before the 18th century, many moral philosophers thought that we could. They thought that fundamental principles of ethics could be seen to be true by the natural light of reason. They were a priori having the same kind of certainty as logic, arithmetic, or geometry. You could see from your armchair that they had to be true. If you couldn't see it, then your understanding must be at fault. Just as if you can't understand that there is no biggest natural number, or no such thing as a round square. For many such principles were innate, inscribed for us by a benevolent deity, so that ignoring them would be a kind of impiety. By the end of the 17th century, this theory had lost a lot of ground, especially among philosophers more ready to trust empirical sense experience as a source of knowledge, rather than allegedly divine revelations. If we want provability, it began to be felt, we cannot rely on God to have put it there. But even the great empiricist John Locke, 1632–1704, subscribed to a rational foundation for the basic principles of morals. The idea of a supreme being, infinite in power, goodness, and wisdom, whose workmanship we are, and on whom we depend, and the idea of ourselves as understanding rational creatures, beings such as are clear in us, would, I suppose, if duly considered and pursued, afford such foundations of our duty and rules of action as might place morality amongst the sciences capable of demonstration, wherein I doubt not but from self-evident propositions, by necessary consequences, as incontestable as those in mathematics, the measures of right and wrong might be made out. To anyone that will apply himself with the same indifferency and attention to the one as he does to the other of these sciences. As this shows, however, Locke thought this was something that could in principle be done, rather than something that had already been done, and he thought it had to be done with an excursus through theology, which scarcely inspires confidence. This view was first challenged in the 18th century by the sentimentalists the Earl of Shaftesbury and Francis Hutcheson, but then with much greater force by David Hume, 1711–76, who took a dim view about the power of reason anywhere, but especially here. For Hume, reason's proper sphere is confined to mathematics and logic, while knowledge about the way things are is due solely to sense experience. Neither affords us any substantive principles of conduct. Hence there are no reasons. Hume drives the message home flamboyantly. Reason is, and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. 'Tis not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger. 'Tis not contrary to reason for me to choose my total ruin, to prevent the least uneasiness of an Indian or person wholly unknown to me. 'Tis as little contrary to reason to prefer even my own acknowledged lesser good to my greater. There is evidence that Hume came to regret the rhetoric in such passages, and he plays it down when he returns to the issue in later works that he came to prefer, notably his inquiry concerning the principles of morals. But he continued to think that human reason has a limited reach. It includes mathematics and logic, for if we try to disobey their laws, understanding gives out and thought itself becomes impossible. We are left with no ideas at all. And we can talk of the reasonable, or scientific approach to understanding the world, which often speaks with one voice, leaving no room for dissent. But when it comes to ethics, we are in the domain of what Hume called passion or sentiment, general terms covering desires, attitudes, emotions, and preferences, the practical dispositions that direct our wills. And it sounds as though in this domain the heart rules everything. That might be misleading. Our passions and sentiments need to operate in the world that we learn about. Mistakes about where we are and what is a prelude to acting disastrously, both for ourselves and others. As we shall see in Part 3, an inability to reason properly is as great a recipe for human disasters as actual vice and malevolence. Stupidity is at least as dangerous as sin. But what we incline towards and are motivated to pursue, after reason and experience have done their work, is another thing. Even basic, unambitious concerns, such as self-interest or sympathy, are not mandated by reason alone. If we choose to neglect our own interests, we may be feckless and imprudent, but we are not contradicting ourselves. The plight of others gives us reasons to act, certainly, but not reasons. There may indeed be some formal limits on our preferences. There is something irrational about preferring A to B, and also at the same time preferring B to A, but there are no substantive restrictions on our passions imposed by reason alone. This could be put in terms of a contrast between description and prescription. Calculation and basic consistency is involved in getting our descriptions of the world right. What we then prescribe is beyond their jurisdiction. This is what Hume meant by saying that reason is in fact wholly at the service of the passions. The passions, preferences, desires, and attitudes that we have are supremely important, for it is only in order to direct them towards effective action that we need to know anything about the world in the first place. 9. The party of mankind. Suppose we imagine an ordinary, everyday, lowercase reason for having acted a certain way. The everyday reason might be, I wanted it, or I liked him, so I did something for him, or that's what would save the most money. A reason might be narrowly selfish, or it might be public-spirited. It helps to promote the general welfare, or it delivers people from horrendous pains and miseries. Such reasons can be appealing. If our sympathies lie in the same direction, we will appreciate them and accept them. And conversely, if they are alien to us, we reject them and see those who are swayed by them as unreasonable and perhaps foolish, impetuous, or stupid. They work in many conversations, but there is no proof that they have to work. It seems to depend how much the audience sympathizes with us, or with humanity, or feels the same way as us. It seems to depend on our tastes or feelings about things. In his great work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Adam Smith happily bit this bullet. His third chapter is entitled, Of the Manner in which we judge of the propriety or impropriety of the affections of other men, by their concord or dissonance with our own. His general mantra is that to approve of another man's opinions is to adopt those opinions, and to adopt them is to approve of them. He recognizes that this is not the whole story, since, for example, if we find a stranger grief-stricken on the death of a loved one, we may approve of their grief without ourselves grieving. We cannot feel as the affected party feels, but for all that we sympathize with the grief, supposing that it is what we ourselves would feel in such a place. And it is that conformity that determines our sense that the grief is appropriate, that this person's heart is in the right place. It is this identity of actual and potential sentiments that makes up agreement in our sentiments. And for Smith, like Hume, agreement in ethical and moral matters is entirely a matter of this consilience or identity of sentiment. An argument about ethical matters is a matter of forging such identity. Of course, not every divergence in how we feel about things has an ethical dimension. There are matters of mere taste or mere preference. You have your tastes, I have mine, and often enough we do not care about the difference. Ethics only rears its head when we feel the need for a common point of view, on matters where anyone else's different sentiments disturb or offend us or stand in the way of what we regard as the thing to do, the way to go. A natural worry is that Smith is making each person his or her own judge of good and bad, right or wrong. In practice, this may be quite realistic about the way moral discussions are conducted, but it seems to leave something missing. Can't we worry whether our own feelings are themselves distorted or less than admirable in various ways? To avoid this kind of worry, Adam Smith softens the egocentric cast of his thought by admitting the self-critical element of human nature. We each have an internalized image of a potential critic. This is the man within the breast, the impartial spectator whose witness of our own conduct matters or should matter to us. Many contemporary ethical thinkers suspect that to judge something to be good, is equivalent to judging that it is what my ideal self would choose. Adam Smith is both socializing and operationalizing the ideal self. That is, rather than some abstract, vague, and hazy idea of perfection, he locates the element of idealization socially in the idea of the gaze of others, and by doing so, he puts flesh and blood on the idea, in the concrete form of impartial scrutiny. It gives him a secularized version of the religious idea of us being open to the scrutiny of the all-seeing eye of God. The poet Robert Burns, himself an avid fan of Smith, echoed the idea when in his poem To a Louse, he lamented that we do not have the gift of seeing ourselves as others see us. It would from many a blunder free us, and foolish notion. We have to admit that to an impartial eye our own peculiarities, including the shape our sentiments take, may look less than lovely. Yet we have to soldier on with the endowment we have, for if we actually judge some sentiment better than our own, then by that very judgment we would be at least on the way towards making it our own. If I really admit that turning right is a better way to go than turning left as I originally intended, then, other things being equal, I turn right. To these thinkers, it wasn't all that difficult to achieve a decent consensus about many issues of ethical importance. They felt able to rely upon a large budget of widely shared sentiments, bedrock elements of almost any unperverted human nature. Hume waxes eloquent on the issue. Besides discretion, caution, enterprise, industry, assiduity, frugality, economy, good sense, prudence, discernment, besides these endowments, I say, whose very names force an avowal of their merit, there are many others to which the most determined skepticism cannot, for a moment, refuse the tribute of praise and approbation. Temperance, sobriety, patience, constancy, perseverance, forethought, considerateness, secrecy, order, insinuation, address, presence of mind, quickness of conception, facility of expression, these, and 1,000 more of the same kind, no man will ever deny to be excellencies and perfections. Equally, it would be easy to write a list of things which we would want a decent political ethics to sustain: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, freedom from want and insecurity, a polity that gives as many people as possible a basis for self-respect. Or, we could put it the other way round, by listing vices and flaws to which people are prone, and the ills of life from which we would want a decent political ethics to help to protect us. For Hume and Smith, such shared goals give a sufficient foundation for ethics. They give us an assurance that while we may not be able to prove a moral opinion to any arbitrary skeptic or abandoned villain, we can expect to find opinions that stand up to the scrutiny of what Hume called the party of mankind, the decent people who have internalized a sense of the authority of the impartial spectator, and therefore whose sentiments are sufficiently like our own for conversation to be worth having. 10. Doing good and living well. Reason does not give up its title to sovereignty over practical affairs without a fight. In this section and section 11, I consider two very different kinds of opposition. The first already existed in the Aristotelian thought that the telos, or goal of a human being, is to live a certain kind of life. What kind of life? Obviously one in which certain basic biological needs for food, warmth, shelter, and perhaps sex are met. Aristotle, however, thought that the intended life for a human being was political, in a society or polis, and their flourishing requires social virtues. It also connects, he thought, with life lived according to reason, and this may seem to give us a kind of foundation for ethics. The vicious or depraved or insensitive or callous are failing to exercise reason, the supreme human capacity. But first of all, why think that the intended or natural life for human beings is a life of virtue? On the face of it, this equation requires a pretty sunny view of the human animal. It is just a matter of observation that evolution has thrown up a human nature with significant elements of selfishness, aggression, vengefulness, short-sightedness, cruelty, and so forth. And some fairly unpleasant people are healthy, to judge by what Bernard Williams nicely describes as the ecological standard of the bright eye and the glossy coat. Conversely, there may be circumstances, one would think, in which virtue requires us to sacrifice something of our own health or happiness. In the limit, virtue and duty may require us to lay down life itself, so there is no automatic alignment between behaving well and looking after ourselves. Aristotle himself was not quite as optimistic as it might sound. He emphasized the need for education and practice in becoming virtuous. It does not just happen, like growing taller but the education is a matter of drawing out a latent potential. At least in the best people, Aristotle is an elitist. The tradition that follows Aristotle is sometimes called the tradition of virtue ethics. It heroically tries to squeeze together what is natural for people: a life lived according to reason, a happy life, and a virtuous life. Seeing all these apparently different things as essentially one and the same, its main device is the social nature of the self. Within society, the knave or villain cannot generally flourish, either in the eyes of others or, ultimately, in his own eyes. The life of injustice is apt to be a life of care and insecurity. If someone prospers by thieving or cheating, his prosperity is likely to turn to ashes. Perhaps this is likely, but it is not at all certain. We only need to think of the way that fraudsters flourish in the environment of the web to realize that it is a political achievement to make sure that departures from virtue bring ruin. Still, it is good to notice that for many purposes that may be enough. A general correlation between the agent's obvious lapses from virtue and her decline from flourishing is enough, for instance, for the purpose of the educator with the subject's interest at heart. We should educate people for whom we care into the habits that are most likely to benefit them, and on this account, these will be the paths of virtue. The educator will not countenance a habit of cheating or lying or taking opportunistic advantage of others, since these things generally diminish the agent's well-being. Generally speaking, people do well by doing good, or at least by avoiding doing bad. Up to a point, no doubt, but it is surely wrong to think that an equation between living as we would wish and living virtuously is somehow written into things by nature. Insofar as it is approximately true, it is because it is written into things by culture. It is in the first place an educational, and also a political achievement, and one that needs constant attention. This is for at least 3 reasons. First, it takes education to instill into the subject the sense of respect and self-respect, which will turn a profit made by losing his soul into a loss. A sufficiently barefaced villain just won't care. Second, it takes a secure and stable political or social system to generate bad effects on the villain, such as loss due to discovery, or loss of reputation. When things are in flux, the villain will be able to cheat and move on. Third, it takes a culture or politics to properly identify a lapse from virtue in any case. To see this last point, we need only consider examples of oppressive societies. Suppose women systematically lack opportunities and resources that the men have. Men and women in such a society may not be conscious of anything wrong here. They have internalized the traditional values. Their conception of what it is for a woman to flourish will be that she is nicely subservient or obedient to the men. In such a world, the man oppressing the woman has no bad conscience and suffers no loss of respect from those he cares about, mainly other men. He can flourish in his own eyes and his friends' eyes, and even in the eyes of the women. The case would be even more obvious if we took behavior towards people outside the community. Consider the wealthy white male who flourishes because of the economic and educational deprivations of people, including children, in the third world. It takes something more than a desire to flourish to motivate in him a serious concern for them. He is all too likely to measure his flourishing only against people like himself. The modern Aristotelian, less inclined to discount inferiors and outsiders than Aristotle himself, can fight back. She can say that such cases need sustaining by rationalizations, and these rationalizations will mainly consist in lies the privileged tell themselves. And a life lived amidst lies, or in a fool's paradise, is not a flourishing life. So the ingredients are there to suggest that real flourishing or true human health implies justice. It implies removing the oppression and living so that we can look other people, even outsiders, in the eye. However, this need for rationalizations is itself not a given. Sometimes, as we go our careless ways, we do not even seem to need lies to sustain us. Our generation may flourish by consuming all the world's resources and letting the future go hang. We do not tell ourselves a story according to which the generations to come are inferior to us and deserve to inherit a deadened world. Mostly, we just don't think about it. And even if they admire movements such as Extinction Rebellion, most people pay little more than lip service to their demands. Like their peers, Extinction Rebels want the heating left on and seem to leave a lot of litter about. Are we being unreasonable as we discount or forget about dispossessed outsiders? We are certainly failing in benevolence, and we may be failing in justice. More on this below. But even if we concede much to the Aristotelian argument, we might remain pessimistic about its effect, insofar as it works by pumping up what is required for a life of reason or a life of true flourishing, we will find people perfectly ready to settle for a good fake. Better to buy the cheap running shoes and not to think too much about how they got made. 11. The categorical imperative. The second answer to Hume's challenge to the role of reasons was given by Immanuel Kant. We can approach his views by thinking of a common gambit in practical discussion. When we try to stop people acting in some sneaky way, a good question is often, what if everybody did that? The test is sometimes called a universalization test. If the answer is that something would go especially wrong if everybody did that, then we are supposed to feel badly about doing it. Perhaps, for instance, we would be claiming an exemption from some rule of conduct for ourselves that we couldn't allow to people in general. Kant picked up the universalization test and ran with it. In his hands, it became not only a particular argument within ethics, a device, as it were, for making people think twice or feel guilty, but the indispensable basis for ethics. It became the foundation stone for ethics, grounding ethics in reason alone. It gives us uppercase reasons, even in the domain of practical choice and desire. He unveils the way this happens in his short masterpiece, The Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals of 1785, a work that has probably inspired more love and hatred, and more passionate commentary than any other in the history of moral philosophy. The universalization test can sound like a version of the golden rule. Do as you would be done by, a rule sometimes claimed by Christianity as its own, but found in some form in almost every ethical tradition, including that of Confucius, 55-1, 47-9 BC. Kant denies that his idea is just that of the golden rule. It is supposed to have more meat. He points out, for example, that the golden rule can be misapplied. A criminal can throw it at a judge, asking him how he would like it if he were being sentenced. Yet the sentence may be just for all that. A person in good circumstances may complacently agree that others should not benefit him, if he could be excused from benefiting them. He apparently abides by the golden rule, so something with more structure is needed. Kant starts by distinguishing what he wants to talk about from what he calls talents of the mind, such as understanding, wit, or judgment, and from advantages of temperament, such as courage, or perseverance, or even benevolence. He also distinguishes it from gifts of fortune, happiness, and even admirable qualities such as moderation. None of these are good in themselves, for all of them can be misused or can be lamented. Even happiness is not admirable, if it is the happiness of a villain. Benevolence may lead us astray, letting other people enjoy what they have no right to enjoy, for example. And the very coolness of a scoundrel makes him not only far more dangerous, but also immediately more abominable in our eyes than we would have taken him to be without it. The only thing good in itself, then, is a good will. Even if the agent with the good will is handicapped by a special disfavor of destiny or by the niggardly endowment of stepmotherly nature from actually doing much good in the world, still, if he has a good will, it must shine like a jewel for its own sake. But what is a good will? Kant considers cases of people doing good things, things that might even be their duty, not, however, from a sense of duty, but from other inclinations, such as self-interest, or even benevolence, or sense of vanity. A salient example is a shopkeeper who does not overcharge an inexperienced customer, but only because his self-interest is served by not doing so. Perhaps he calculates that the customer is more likely to return, or that his shop will profit from a good reputation. The shopkeeper behaves honestly enough, but not because he has the right feeling that he ought to do so. There is no jewel shining by itself here. This is not the goodwill in operation. So what is? The shape of the answer becomes clear from such examples. The goodwill is one acting from a particular good motive. It is one acting out of a sense of law or duty. Duty is the necessity of an action from respect for law. We are able to represent laws of action in ourselves, and a goodwill is one that acts in accordance with that representation. The core of morality, then, lies not in what we do, but in our motives in doing it. When moral worth is at issue, what counts is not actions which one sees, but those inner principles of action that one does not see. This is all very well, we might say. Kant seems to be praising up the conscientious agent, or the agent of principle or righteousness or rectitude. This is a person who, once he thinks such and such is a duty, is strong-minded or principled enough not to be deflected from doing it. This is in some respects an admirable psychology, although it is also one that can do a lot of harm, since people's consciences can be as perverted as anything else. One wonders why righteousness in this sense is exempt from the criticism leveled at benevolence or efficiency in action, that employed in the wrong way they can be a bad thing. Some writers also remind us that in many of life's situations, rectitude is not what we want. We often want people to act out of love or gratitude, not out of duty. Good parents take their child to an entertainment because they enjoy the child's pleasure. A parent who takes the child out of a sense of duty is not quite the thing. A lover who kisses out of a sense of duty is due for the boot. But this is not a fundamental criticism of Kant. He can, and does, allow dimensions in which the good-hearted parent or lover or benefactor scores highly. It is just that these are not, for him, the moral dimension. Moral excellence is found only in the strength of the sense of duty. There is a more fundamental difficulty. Kant's answer seems to demand that certain things got onto a list of duties in the first place. It is no good saying act from a sense of duty, if when asked the question, and what is my duty? The only reply is to act from a sense of duty. We have to break out of the circle somewhere. And so far we do not know how. So, how is it all going to get us nearer to the foundations Kant promises? His move is breathtaking, in both its speed and its result. But what kind of law can that be, the representation of which must determine the will, even without regard for the effect expected from it? In order for the will to be called good absolutely and without limitation, since I have deprived the will of every impulse that could arise for it, from obeying some law, nothing is left but the conformity of actions as such with universal law, which alone is to serve the will as its principle. That is, I ought never to act except in such a way that I could also will that my maxim should become a universal law. This is the famous categorical imperative, or more accurately, the categorical imperative in its first form, the so-called formula of universal law. Later on, Kant glosses it in other ways. One is act as if the maxim of your action were to become by your will a universal law of nature, the formula of the law of nature. Another, possibly the most influential, is so act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means, the formula of humanity. It is not at all clear that these different versions can be derived one from the other, but Kant regarded them as somehow equivalent. The promise is that we have here both quite substantial moral principles, or versions of the one principle, and that these are principles that have been proved by reason alone. This last claim is hard to make good, but perhaps the idea goes like this. As Hume illustrates, we might suppose that there are no reasons in the area of ethics, just the desires or wills of particular persons, not necessarily shared or respected by anyone else. But Kant thinks that the very formal nature of the categorical imperative gives it a universal authority. You cannot flout it and defend your principle in doing so. If you do flout it, you declare yourself to be unreasonable. If this is right, we have the required foundation. Ethics comes from reasons alone. The most persuasive examples of the categorical imperative doing some real work are cases where there is an institution whose existence depends on sufficient performance by a sufficient number of people. Suppose, as is plausible, that our ability to give and receive promises depends upon general compliance with the principle of keeping promises. Were we to break them sufficiently often, or were promise-breaking to become a law of nature, then there would be no such thing as promise-giving or promise-breaking, because no words could any longer have the required force. So, Kant considers somebody whose principle of action is, let me, when hard pressed, make a promise with the intention not to keep it. Then, says Kant, I could will the lie, but I could not will the universal law to lie, for in accordance with such a law there would be no promises at all. It would be willing a kind of contradiction. So, we have a reason against the lying promise. That's all very well, but consider a person who is indifferent to the whole business of giving and receiving promises. Why shouldn't he ignore any damage to the institution? After all, this would be a plausible diagnosis of many contemporary politicians. They just don't care about any long-term damage their lying ways cause. Of course, nicer benevolent of prudent persons wouldn't be so careless or complacent, but if Kant appeals to these virtues, his difference from Hume and Smith vanishes. We only have a reason against giving the lying promise, not a reason. Kant descends somewhat from the abstract heights of the formula of universal law version of the categorical imperative. He hymns the way we can distance ourselves from our mundane desires and wishes, and set ourselves to act as duty requires. This capacity itself gives us our fundamental title to respect and self-respect. It deserves respect wherever it is found, that is, within all rational agents. This argument, or something like it, the texts are dense, takes Kant to the formula of humanity. So act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. It is not, of course, easy to see exactly what this involves, but the general idea of remembering to respect each other is clearly attractive, and perhaps more practicable than remembering to love each other. Whether we deserve respect purely because of our capacity to make laws to ourselves is a good deal less certain. Perhaps we deserve respect from each other insofar as we are like each other in a whole mass of ways. Many people think Kant offers the best possible attempt to find reasons, and therefore to justify ethics on the basis of reason alone, since many people want such an attempt to succeed, and fear the result if it does not. There are major intellectual industries of trying to find ever more complicated interpretations of the attempt that make it work. It's a worthy ambition, but it is doubtful whether it does much to improve on the urbane views of Hume and Smith. After all, if we return to the complacent, wealthy individual who cares little for the plight of others, it is unlikely that we will get much traction by suggesting that he is ignoring binding, inescapable reasons for being better. Like the lying politician, if his conscience is already slumbering, it is unlikely to awaken, because Kant tells him that, as well as being unimaginative, callous, and selfish, he is also irrational. 12. The state of nature. If our capacity for ethical behavior is not immediately given by our nature as human beings, nor by an inescapable birthright of reason, where does it come from? Perhaps it is a social construction. In the modern world, one of the earliest and most influential attempts to answer the question this way was that of Thomas Hobbes, 1588-1679. Hobbes imagined a pre-social world in which individuals bent on their own survival lived in competition for resources. Famously, he described this as the war of all against all. No arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. How could people pull themselves out of this fearful state? Hobbes makes two moves. First, he supposes that his agents can get together and contract into a common policy. And second, he thinks that their common policy could or should be one of submitting to a sovereign, or in other words, voluntarily handing a monopoly of power to one agent, who, it is then assumed, will hold the ring, using the monopoly so granted for the benefit of all. John Locke's comment on this second stage is well known, but good enough to repeat. As if when men, quitting the state of nature, entered into society, they agreed that all of them but one should be under the restraint of laws, but that he should still retain all the liberty of the state of nature, increased with power, and made licentious by impunity. This is to think that men are so foolish that they take care to avoid what mischiefs may be done them by polecats or foxes, but are content, nay, think it safety, to be devoured by lions. But philosophically, the more interesting problems already arise at the first stage. How are Hobbesian agents supposed to enter into a contract or binding agreement? Hobbes saw the problem clearly enough. If a covenant be made, in the condition of mere nature, which is a condition of war of every man against every man, upon any reasonable suspicion it is void, for he that performeth first has no assurance the other will perform. After, because the bonds of words are too weak to bridle men's ambition, avarice, anger, and other passions, and therefore he which performeth first does but betray himself to his enemy. It takes a precondition of minimal trust for me to enter an agreement to lay down my arms on your say so that you will also do so, or to do a job for you on your say so that you will return the favor later. And this trust does not exist in the imagined state of nature. If we postulate a state of nature like that of Hobbes, and a ruthlessly self-interested human animal, then apparently the problem of getting more than minimal social relations up and running is insoluble. The minimal social relations that might exist would be those of reciprocity, where I temporarily sacrifice some of my own interests, doing something for another, but only on the expectation that he does something at least equivalent for me. Even reciprocity, however, needs assurance. I am just a patsy if I spend my morning getting fleas out of your hide, unless I can expect you to return the favor. And in Hobbes's world, there's no way to give that assurance. Someone once quipped that a verbal promise is not worth the paper it is written on. But in Hobbes's world, even written promises are not worth anything either. Some writers have complained that Hobbes's problem is, not so far as we know, one that human beings ever had to face. There never was a state of nature, and we are not the egoistical monsters that Hobbes assumed. But we come to understand our concepts better if we can understand the way they might have developed from a previous state. This does not need to be a matter of providing actual history with dated events and times. It can start with a type of state that we can imagine to have existed, and a plausible series of changes that would have ended up with us as we are. From an evolutionary perspective, the emergence of conventions of restraint and cooperation is a problem as long as we suppose that animals that sacrifice their own fitness for others must surely lose in the Darwinian struggle for reproductive success. So it is all very well saying that the human being is a social animal, but if biological theory appears to deny that any such animal can exist, we are still left with a problem. The emergence of something better is usually modeled by means of simple games, of which the best known is the famous prisoner's dilemma. In such a situation, it is socially best if we come to some cooperative arrangement. But each of us can look after our own interests best by defecting from this arrangement. In the original story, a prosecutor has two suspects, Adam and Eve, who are charged with a crime. But he needs a confession, so he gives each of them, independently, a choice to confess or not. If you confess, he says to each, then if the other confesses too, you will be convicted and serve 2 years each. But if you confess and the other does not, you will get off scot-free for having helped the court, although the other who does not confess will be convicted and hammered as a hard case, serving 3 years. But if the other does not confess either, you will each serve 1 year on the lesser charge of wasting police time. It is easy to verify that each prisoner has a decisive argument from self-interest for confessing. You do better by confessing whatever the other does. If the other confesses, you had better do so as well, so serving 2 years instead of 3, and if the other sits tight, you can confess and get off scot-free. Yet if each follows this policy, the social outcome is worst of all, 4 person years in prison, when by each staying silent they could have accumulated only 2 person years in prison. 1 each. It is as if instead of the invisible hand imagined by Adam Smith, whereby an atomistic society of self-interested individuals unintentionally improved the social world for everyone, there is an invisible boot whereby the same individuals unintentionally drive society towards the worst outcome. Of course, the prisoner's situation is highly unusual, but many real-life situations can be modeled as multi-person prisoner's dilemmas, in which self-interested reasoning will lead to a non-cooperative, worse situation. Yet the self-interested argument is good enough to tempt us. If there is a water shortage, the best social result is that we each restrain our usage. But if the others restrain their usage, my self-interest is better served by using as much water as I wish. One person's usage does not make much difference to the overall supply, whilst if the others do not restrain their usage, my self-interest means that I had better not do so either. The water is going to run out anyhow, and I need to have watered my garden and taken my showers before it does so. It is similar with the temptation to fish to an unsustainable level, to go in for aggressive wage rises, to keep guns, and so on. Other social problems are better mirrored by a closely related structure, the so-called assurance game. The classic example of this is the stag hunt, described by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We have to join together to hunt a stag. Perhaps we each need to stop one of the exits from the wood, and if one is left unstopped, the stag will escape. If we do catch one, then we will each share the result, and that is best of all individually, unlike in the prisoner's dilemma, where confessing is individually better. Unfortunately, each of us has a temptation to leave our post. There are hares about, and one can catch a hare all by oneself. Hares are good to eat, much better than nothing, even if not quite so good as a portion of stag. But now each of us needs assurance that nobody else will be tempted to chase a hare. If someone does, any of us who stand by our post ends up with nothing. Too great a risk, we might think, in which case we all chase hares and end up with the second best outcome all round. Too bad, but nice guys finish last, say the more ruthless beasts in the jungle. Cooperation is for losers. Greed is good. A landscape of trust and cooperation is always ready to be invaded by freeloaders who can exploit it for their own benefit, and these are the ones who will win out in the end. Or are they? Fortunately, we need to imagine repeated interactions of these kinds and suppose that in the mix there are examples of cooperation, for instance in families and kin groups, or in groups that can only survive through cooperative endeavors, such as together driving dangerous predators off their prey in order to profit from the food this makes available. Then it would not be long before it began to be noticed that these are the people doing better. If success is measured by number of descendants, and we use the prisoner's dilemma arithmetic in reverse so that more is better, then the cooperative people are set to outbreed the others. They might have 4 descendants after a generation, whereas a group of defectors only have 2. And if the trait is inherited either by a genetic modification or by culture and upbringing, then even when a defector meets a cooperator and has 3 children, they in turn will be defectors, and again set to do worse. Over a period, nice guys finish first. 13. The emergence of norms. In short, an adaptive mutation in a gene may benefit individuals because it enables them to cooperate in a group, and may spread because it does so. It has recently been discovered that even trees cooperate, feeding nutrients to needy neighbors so that the forest as a whole benefits from their solidarity. And if trees can do it, it should not be surprising that we can. The upshot is that while no plan or agreement can release us from a war of all against all, practicing cooperation and observation of its benefits can wean us from it, over time and with repeated experience. The first writer to understand this well was, once more, David Hume, who saw this way the emergence of such things as conventions, whereby we do something together, each acting only on the supposition others will do their part. This can happen without any prior thought or prior signaling. It can just be something we do. In Hume's own example, 2 men rowing a boat together fall into a coordination with each other. Eventually, our conventions give us the whole wonderful social apparatus of property, money, language, law, and government. Hume describes the norms that make up these practices as norms of justice. When you default on a promise or an expected instance of cooperation, you do an injustice to someone. He aptly writes that the happiness and prosperity of mankind, arising from the social virtue of benevolence and its subdivisions, may be compared to a wall built by many hands, which still rises by each stone that is heaped upon it, and receives increase proportional to the diligence and care of each workman. The same happiness, raised by the social virtue of justice and its subdivisions, may be compared to the building of a vault, where each individual stone would, of itself, fall to the ground, nor is the whole fabric supported but by the mutual assistance and combination of its corresponding parts. It is only once these developments take place in society that we find that full flowering of what philosophers describe as normativity, the arrival of norms of expected behavior, defection from which is a social transgression. Norms give us the musts that infuse social life. They are the cement in the vault Hume talks about. Some may be quite trivial, as when children agree that as they play hide and seek, whoever is it must cover their eyes and count to 10, or it is agreed that when we play chess, the king must only move 1 square at a time. Such musts are there for our convenience, for without them activities such as hide and seek or chess become impossible. But the same construction underlies more serious activities and serious institutions, not games like hide and seek, but the serious scaffoldings of life, like language, money, law, and trust. Being governed by rules and norms may seem a hindrance to self-interest, but that is far from the truth. Norms are in fact the indispensable servants of enlightened self-interest. The rules of language determining how we must speak or write are there, since without them communication becomes impossible. The fact that other people must abstain from your property is there, because without it security and safety evaporate, and so on. Rights, duties, and arguably the whole notion of treating people justly, according to their deserts, here swim into view. The boast in the popular song "I Did It My Way" is one of the most absurd and nauseating lies ever to gain currency. You did it by sheltering under a vast arch, or if we prefer it, sitting on the top of a vast pyramid, acting in ways made possible only by the cooperative activities of countless others and countless generations. You spoke their language, ate the food they discovered, profited from the inventions they made, traveled their roads, used their money, and sheltered under their laws. Hume saw that the conditional nature of these activities, the fact that we perform them only on the condition that others play along, implies a kind of reciprocity. As already mentioned in Section 4, it is an elaboration of the idea that if you scratch my back, I shall scratch yours, elevated to be a fundamental building block of the institutions of society. This raises a thorny question of justice for those who have, as it were, little or nothing to bring to the bargain. It need not be in our self-interest to bring them into the circle. Rather, unappealingly, Hume bites the bullet. Were there a species of creatures, intermingled with men, which, though rational, were possessed of such inferior strength, both of body and mind, that they were incapable of all resistance, and could never, upon the highest provocation, make us feel the effects of their resentment, the necessary consequence, I think, is that we should be bound, by the laws of humanity, to give gentle usage to these creatures, but should not, properly speaking, lie under any restraint of justice with regard to them. There is a whiff here of might being right, whereby issues of justice do not arise when one party has all the power over another. The weaker can only rely on the benevolence of the stronger party. which is likely to be a fairly unreliable matter. The problem was well known in classical times. The historian Thucydides relates a chilling dialogue in which the stronger Athenians try to compel the weaker Melians to their will, threatening them with destruction and dismissing contemptuously any appeal to justice in their dealings, claiming instead that it is a law amongst both gods and men, that the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer as they must. Interestingly enough, the philosopher Nietzsche, usually thought of as an opponent of normal morality, later came, perhaps unwittingly, to Hume's rescue. He thought that once justice was elevated to an ideal, it would, as it were, spread its glow over ever greater areas of human interaction. Since, in accordance with their intellectual habit, men have forgotten the original purpose of so-called just and fair actions, and especially because children have for millennia been trained to admire and imitate such actions, it has gradually come to appear that a just action is an unegoistic one, but it is on this appearance that the high value accorded it depends, and this high value is, moreover, continually increasing, as all valuations do, for something highly valued is striven for, imitated, multiplied through sacrifice, and grows as the worth of the toil and zeal expended by each individual is added to the worth of the valued thing. How little moral would the world appear without forgetfulness? A poet could say that God has placed forgetfulness as a doorkeeper on the threshold of the temple of human dignity. The suggestion is that any pride in our ability to care about justice requires forgetting its egoistic basis in interactions in which we exchange benefits with reciprocal partners, although it has spread from there to embrace much wider circles of our interactions. As beneficiaries of these centuries of change, good people, not all of us, and unfortunately not many governments, naturally feel uneasy about unfair dealings with weaker partners. We find it natural to take them into the sphere of justice. And good for us. If Nietzsche's suggestion seems a little speculative, we might want to compare it with this case. Most of us feel uncomfortable if we hear that people are trashing our reputations. Rightly so, since a loss of reputation is dangerous. It may precede all kinds of loss and difficulty. Enlightened self-interest demands concern about it. But we would also be uncomfortable to know that future generations will say nothing but bad things about us, as well they might. Given that we are busy squandering the world's resources, why, when we can't suffer a single jot from anything they may say? The answer parallels Nietzsche's. We have internalized the value of a clear reputation to a point beyond its original connection with self-interest. Adam Smith's impartial spectator, the man within the breast, can act as trustee for any complaints of future generations, powerless to deal with us as they are. And this is all that Nietzsche is suggesting about justice. Hume Smith, sociable 18th century gentleman, start with a picture of human beings as reasonably benevolent, self-interested, capable of foresight, interested in each other's sentiments, and willing to take up a common point of view with others. Hume especially refused to take sides over what he called the dignity or meanness of human nature, although this was a hot topic at the time. He thought his genealogy required only that there should be some particle of the dove needed in our nature, alongside elements of the wolf and the serpent. There is not much talk at the earliest stage of cooperation of duty, rights, obligations, or rules. But these all swim into view under the heading of justice. Once institutions such as promise-giving and promise-taking, or property or law, are in place, then we have rules or normativity. We begin to think in terms of things we must do, or things we may demand from others. Things stop being just a question of sympathy or concern, which admit of graduations, but of who has rights, or what justice requires, or what our duty is. It is a question of what is permissible and what is wrong. These are called deontological notions, after the Greek deontos, meaning duty. They have a coercive edge. They take us beyond what we admire, or regret, or prefer, or even what we want other people to prefer. They take us to thoughts about what the rules or norms require. Some writers see these notions as introducing polar opposites to ideas of things we happen to want, such as happiness, security, or liberty. But by seeing normativity as a natural outgrowth of our attempts to achieve these things together, Hume and Smith softened the contrast. We cannot have the pleasures that tennis gives without the rules of tennis, the shelter of the laws without the rule of law, and we cannot have the pleasure society opens to us without the conventions that make society possible.